sin, transgression, and iniquity. 3 different things to God. Could you actually explain the difference between them? Most English Bibles blur all 3 into a single word, sin, and most readers never notice. But the original Hebrew never treated these as synonyms. One word describes a mistake made without intent. Another describes a line crossed on purpose, a conscious act of rebellion. And the third is the most disturbing of all, a twisting inside a person that repeats, deepens, and eventually becomes part of who they are. The priests in the Jerusalem temple had to identify exactly which one had occurred before they could even accept a sacrifice. Somewhere along the way, that distinction got flattened out of our translations. And once you see it again, it changes how you read the Bible's entire understanding of the human heart. The scene opens at the base of Mount Sinai, only weeks after one of the most solemn moments recorded anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. Israel had just heard the voice of God shake the mountain itself. Thick cloud, lightning splitting the sky, a trumpet blast growing louder and louder until the people begged Moses to be the one who spoke with God from then on, because they were afraid they would die if they heard that voice directly again. In that fire and smoke, the nation formally accepted the terms of a covenant. "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do," they said, according to Exodus chapter 24, verse 3. Fewer than 40 days later, at the foot of that same mountain, the people melted down their own jewelry God himself had let them carry out of Egypt, and shaped it into a golden calf, crediting a statue with the freedom only God had provided. Moses came down carrying 2 stone tablets, written by the finger of God, and shattered them at the sight. What happened next is one of the most important and most overlooked moments in the entire Hebrew Bible. God called Moses back up the mountain. And there, in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, he made a declaration about his own character. The Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. 3 separate words. Not one word repeated 3 times for poetic emphasis, the way Hebrew poetry so often works. 3 distinct terms, chosen with precision, to describe 3 different ways a person can fail before God. Let's start with the first. The one nearly every English translation simply calls sin. In Hebrew, it's the word chata, and its literal meaning surprises most people the first time they hear it. To miss the mark. It's the exact same root used in the book of Judges, chapter 20, verse 16, to describe 700 left-handed warriors who could sling a stone at a single hair and not miss. Chata, in its original sense, isn't primarily about calculated wickedness. It's about a target that existed, God's intention, and a person who fell short of it. It could be weakness, ignorance, a single careless moment. The target was there, and the arrow simply landed outside it. That's precisely why Leviticus chapter 4 describes a specific offering reserved for this category. The sin offering for something done unintentionally, by mistake, without full awareness. An animal, blood poured out on the altar to cover something the person often didn't even realize they had done. Even the amount of the animal changed depending on who had missed the mark. A priest, the whole community, a leader, or an ordinary individual, showing how carefully this category was measured. But if God's declaration at Sinai had stopped there, it wouldn't have needed 2 more words. Because there's something in human nature that goes far beyond a target missed by accident. The second word is pesha, and Hebrew scholars agree on something unsettling. It doesn't describe an error at all. It describes a boundary crossed on purpose. The prophet Isaiah uses it in the very first chapter of his book, recording God's complaint. "I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me." Rebelled, from pesha. This isn't the child who wanders off the path by accident. This is the child who knows the path by heart, and chooses another one anyway, glancing back while they walk away. The book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 27 through 31, draws this line with striking clarity. There is sin committed unintentionally, which calls for a reconciling sacrifice. And there is sin committed with a high hand, in open, deliberate defiance, a category the law treated with far greater severity, one serious enough to cut a person off from the community entirely. The prophet Amos builds nearly his entire second chapter around this one word, nation after nation, repeating the same formula. For 3 transgressions of this people, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. Using pesha to describe not isolated mistakes, but a repeated pattern of conscious rebellion against what these nations already knew was right. Generations earlier, that same word appears on the lips of Joseph's own brothers in one of the most emotional scenes in the entire book of Genesis. After their father Jacob dies, terrified that Joseph will finally settle the score for being sold into slavery as a teenager, they send him a message recorded in Genesis chapter 50, verse 17. Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin. Transgression, pesha, right next to chata. Joseph's brothers knew exactly what they were doing when they threw him into a pit and sold him to traders. That's precisely why, years later, asking for forgiveness, they reach for the heavier word to name what they had done. Even in the book of Job, one of the oldest texts in the entire Bible, a young man named Elihu describes the dangerous path from a simple mistake toward open rebellion. For he adds rebellion to his sin, he says in Job chapter 34, verse 37, joining chata and pesha in a single sentence. The initial error that, left uncorrected, hardens into conscious defiance. The law reflected this same distinction in the structure of its offerings. Alongside the sacrifice for unintentional sin, Leviticus chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, describes another kind entirely. The guilt offering, required when someone deliberately deceived a neighbor, stole, or lied under oath to keep something that wasn't theirs. That sacrifice alone wasn't enough. The person also had to return what they had taken, plus an extra 20%. Conscious rebellion demands more than an altar. It demands restitution. If you want to know the third word, the darkest of the three, stay with us, because it's about to be revealed. The third word in the Exodus 34 declaration is, according to scholars of biblical Hebrew, the deepest and most sobering of all. Ivon, iniquity. Where chata describes a target missed and pesha describes a line crossed, avon describes something bent on the inside. Its root carries the idea of curvature, of distortion, not simply out of place, but twisted, deformed, carrying its own weight within itself. It isn't a single event, it's a condition, one that settles in and deepens over time, generation after generation, until it becomes part of who a person is. King David puts this into words with startling honesty in Psalm 51, the same psalm where he begs forgiveness for his transgressions after his sin with Bathsheba. A few verses later, in verse 5, he writes something even more uncomfortable. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Iniquity, avon, doesn't describe a single act there. It describes an inclination David recognizes he carried before he was ever old enough to choose anything at all. Scholars debate exactly how far that statement reaches theologically, but the text is clear about one thing. There's a distortion deeper than any accidental mistake or any single act of rebellion, a bent that no one chose at birth, yet carries all the same, quietly shaping choices long before a person is even aware it's there. That same weight resurfaces in the most solemn ritual on the ancient Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, known in Hebrew as Yom Kippur, still observed today by Jewish communities around the world with fasting and prayer. Leviticus chapter 16 describes how the high priest took 2 goats. One was sacrificed on the altar. On the other, still living, Aaron laid both hands in front of the entire assembly of Israel and confessed over it, according to verse 21, all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions, all their sins. All 3 words together again, avon, pesha, and chata, before that second goat was sent out into the wilderness, carrying that weight away from the camp, never to return. Scholars who study the ritual point out that this pairing, one animal sacrificed, one sent away, was meant to picture 2 separate realities, a price paid and a guilt removed entirely. Centuries later, the same 3 words converge again in the mouth of another prophet, describing a suffering still to come. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. Transgressions, pesha, iniquities, avon. A verse later, Isaiah closes the image with a shepherd's metaphor. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Iniquity, avon again. The deepest of the 3 words, this time carried by someone else entirely. Christian tradition reads this passage as a messianic prophecy, fulfilled according to the Gospels in the person of Jesus. Centuries before Isaiah, the prophet Micah had already captured that same hope in one of the most beautiful questions in the entire Old Testament. Micah chapter 7, verses 18 and 19. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression? He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. Iniquity, transgression, sin. The same three Hebrew roots, pictured this time sinking to the bottom of the ocean, gone for good. Which brings us back to that original declaration at Sinai. The order of the words isn't random. Forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. God begins with the deepest of the three, the oldest, most deeply rooted distortion, and only after that mentions conscious rebellion, and finally the simple missed mark. It isn't a list building towards the worst offense. It's the reverse. It's a declaration that nothing, not even the most deeply embedded condition, falls outside the reach of that mercy. Maybe that's the real reason these three words survived, kept separate, through thousands of years of hand-copied manuscripts. Maybe it's because every person at some point recognizes all three inside themselves. The target you knew perfectly well and still missed, the line you saw clearly and crossed anyway, and that older, harder-to-name inclination that seemed to be there before you ever learned how to choose anything at all. The Bible doesn't treat these three things as equal. It never reduces a careless mistake to the same category as calculated rebellion, and it never confuses a passing failure with a condition carried for generations. But it doesn't treat any of them as too large to be forgiven either. So when you hear these three words, sin, transgression, iniquity, which one do you recognize first in your own life? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this kind of deep dive into the original biblical text is something you enjoy, consider subscribing to the channel.